grow old, never grow in a land where we'll never grow.
Welcome back to a study of General Biblical Introduction. My name is Keith Mosher, and I have been taping some information on how we got our English Bibles, in essence. And this study in General Biblical Introduction encompasses inspiration, verbal plenary inspiration of the autographs or originals. Then we looked at canonicity, which is a study of which books are divine, which books belong in the Bible. Do we have all of the books we're supposed to have? That's a great study. This third section of General Biblical Introduction, and the last section to study in this area of investigation of the text, is called Textual Criticism. And we've taken a look at all of the evidence that's available to men called textual critics who collate or examine all of this manuscript evidence, intending in a scientific way to produce the autograph or the original. And we are fortunate because of the work they do. They have discovered that in all of the manuscript evidence for Old and New Testament, there are something like 200,000 variants in those manuscripts. That sounds terrible to the neophyte in this area of study. However, it shouldn't be so scary. When they find 3,000 Greek manuscripts, and each one has a spelling error in it of some word, they count that as 3,000 variants. But when you look at the real differences, we can honestly and technically and concisely say that as far as the autograph is concerned, those words about which we're not absolutely sure are fewer than just one sentence full. That's an amazing fact. And so they count the variants in terms of spelling, or perhaps the handwritten manuscript had the in it instead of just the. So those are considered variants. And there are at least 3, maybe 4 families of manuscripts that are examined coming from different parts of the world. And if you have a critical Greek Testament, you will note at the bottom of each page some large letters, capital letters, except for one that looks like an X. It's the Aleph sound in Hebrew. That's the Sinaiticus Uncial, a large letter manuscript from about AD 300. And it is a complete Bible kept in the British Museum. It's in Greek, all large letters, no paragraphs, no punctuation, uncials. Then we looked at the minuscules and cursives, the small letter looks like handwriting, Greek. And there are several thousand of those. And they follow some rules, these textual critics do, when they are examining these manuscripts. And we understood that the translators today have at their disposal about 5,984 more manuscripts than the King James translators did when they were doing their work in 1611. Variants are caused by scribal error. Now, when the movable type was invented and Gutenberg's press could reproduce manuscripts, then these handwritten errors disappeared. And so it's the case that the textual critic takes written records, handwritten records, typed records, and examines it all. The primary task of the textual critic is to examine it for an effort to get to the autograph. We talked last time in the last session about the English language. If we were studying General Biblical Introduction in France, we would look at how we got the French Bible, but we're in the area where English is spoken. And so we're beginning a look at our English translations. And we made mention of the fact that English is the daughter of the German language. and the Anglo language. And the early English Bibles are called Anglo-Saxon, English German, so to speak. When you think about that kind of English, from Angleland, you're going way back in history, even before the Middle Ages. Modern English, however, is dated from the time of the movable type, around the 1450s, AD 1450. And so we're going to look first at some manuscripts that are called Anglo-Saxon Bibles. And in essence, then, we're looking at some early English versions, but they're not easily read by a person who reads modern English. So from about AD 670, we have a Bible in Anglo-Saxon. Well, we have part of a Bible. In fact, it's really written in the form of a song. And it was done by a fellow, and we know who it was. It was Caedmon, C-A-E-D-O-M. He claimed that he dreamed about an angel who sang a song to him. That was his claim. And he said, I wasn't gifted in poetry or song, so the angel told me what I was to sing. And the angel supposedly told Caedmon, now you sing about the creation of God. So he began to sing, as he put it, phrases he had never heard before. Well, his statements are highly questionable, to say the least. But what he had were paraphrases from the biblical account of creation in the Anglo-Saxon language. Those paraphrases by Caedmon became known in his day, now this is in 670, as the People's Bible. And that's all they had in their language. And a lot of people in Caedmon's day would memorize those songs, those paraphrases about God's creation. As far as I know right now, that's the earliest piece of a Bible that we have in the Anglo-Saxon language that is the forerunner of the English language. The second work that we have in our possession comes from about AD 700, maybe 30 years or so after Caedmon, and it was developed by a man named Aldhelm. That's an odd name, A-L-D-H-E-L-M, Aldhelm. He actually had a straightforward translation of several parts of the Bible, mostly the Psalms. And so now you have a work that's an actual translation in the Anglo-Saxon language and taken from the Greek and Hebrew Bible, the Psalms and some other parts of the Bible by Aldhelm. So now you've jumped from paraphrases to actual translating work. This is AD 700. The four gospel accounts in the Anglo-Saxon language, translated from the original, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, came around in about AD 700 also. And the work we have is attributed to a fellow named Egbert, E-G-B-E-R-T. He had a school of the Bible near York, England, and under orders from Charlemagne, the Archbishop of York, he did his translating work there at the court of Aachen, A-A-C-H-E-N. We know a lot then about the background of Egbert's work. And these are actual translations of the first four books of the New Testament. So we're working toward translating. And this is important because without translating, most of us couldn't read the Bible. We have to have it in our language. And early on now, people are recognizing You think about the people singing Caedmon's paraphrases. They were so hungry for the Word of God that anything they had, they tried to memorize. Let's move forward a little bit to perhaps the greatest English scholar of his day, and maybe all of Europe. This is the Venerable Bede, or Bede. He died in 735, AD 735. I've mentioned him before in this study. Bede's historical efforts, theological efforts, his scholastic efforts were second to none in his day. One of the great scholars of that time, in other words. He started a translation of the Gospel according to John from the Latin into the Anglo-Saxon language, and finished that work the very hour he died. Egbert, all above, also had finished his efforts days before Bede died. So now you have two men, same era, who translated John, same time, into Anglo-Saxon. We can look at those translations and get an idea of what they had to use as their autograph. Now, one from the Latin, one from the Greek. Egbert from the Greek, Bede from the Latin. We move forward now to the AD 800s. And in AD 49, a man was born who became known as King Alfred the Great. He took Bede's ecclesiastical history and translated it from the Latin in which the Venerable Bede had written it, and translated Bede's work into Anglo-Saxon. He also, Alfred did, translated the Ten Commandments from the Hebrew. He translated Acts 15 from the Greek. And incidentally, in his translating work, he had a negative form of the Golden Rule. If you had to read the novel Beowulf when you were in high school, or maybe you're familiar with it or not, this is a book written in the Anglo-Saxon language during this period when Alfred the Great lived, the middle of the 9th century, about AD 850. And the tales of Beowulf show just how barbaric a time it was in history, sadly. But Alfred was able, even though he lived in that barbaric time, to translate parts of the Bible. Alfred the Great is known for the Dane Law, which demanded Christian baptism and loyalty to the king. And during his reign, a religious revival took place in Britain, Angleland. And here is a man who is the head of his country translating religious works. You remember that when Moses told the people when they came into the land they could have a king, Deuteronomy chapter 17. But he told them this king has to be one who copies the law. He has to be religious. Well, of course, the Jews never had a king like that. About 100 years later, around AD 950 now, there was an Anglo-Saxon named Aldred, not Alfred, Aldred. These names can run together after a while. Caedmon, Aldhelm, Egbert, Alfred, Aldred. You get a little confused. But he produced an interlinear gloss. He would have the original language here, and then underneath it, a translation, same page. This is called a gloss. And he was using a Latin text, so he translated word for word from the Latin, just dropped down underneath the word and told you what that word meant. Then you have to put the sentence together for yourself. This Latin Bible was the work of Eadrid, the Bishop of Lindisfarne. That work is called the Lindisfarne Gospels, produced around 721. Well, Aldred took the Lindisfarne Gospels and put a translation under each word. There was a copycat version of the Lindisfarne Gospels done in that same period by a fellow evidently trying to sell his work. His name was Mac Regal, and his work is called the Rushworth Gospels. But he was just copying really what Aldred had done in the Lindisfarne Gospels. A lot of this gets confusing because of the names and the eras in which they lived, and we're not familiar with a lot of them, but you know now what's being done. People are starting to see, we need something in our own language. What's the Bible say? We can't read that Latin. We can't read that Greek. We can't read that Hebrew. And so men are going to work, some of them for financial reasons, but at least they're doing the work of translating. Let's move ahead to the last of the truly Anglo-Saxon works. This is AD 1000 by the Abbot of Eindom in Wessex. His name was Aelfric, A-E-L-F-R-I-C. Now you've got Aldred and Aldred and Aelfric and Egbert, and it's getting confusing. But Aelfric translated the first 7 books of the Old Testament from Latin to Anglo-Saxon. So in essence, he didn't have a version. He had a revision of the Latin. You have to go from the original language to the receptor language if you want to call it a version. But so when they work in the Latin or some other thing, if we went from English to German, that wouldn't be a version. That would be a revision. And so technically what he did, Aelfric, was to revise the Latin to the Anglo-Saxon. And we have copies of some of Aelfric's sermons or homilies, and he mentions a large number of other Old Testament verses, so we know how they looked in his day and what they were like. He also used the Wessex Gospels, which were done by somebody, and we don't know who this is. If any one of you Bible scholars ever finds out who copied or translated the Wessex Gospels, W-E-S-S-E-X, that'd be an interesting find, because they were done before Aelfric came along, and we don't really know who did them. But he was using those gospel accounts in his preaching work. And so here he is translating the Old Testament and using the New Testament in his preaching work, so we can look at his sermon outlines and see some of the verses he used in the New Testament. And Aelfric wrote something, and I want to mention this because I want you to see what they were thinking in those days. Now, in your mind, go all the way back to AD 1000, then go back further in your mind. The people thought, when they looked at the Latin, that that was God's language. And you remember that people who saw the early Greek testaments wondered what kind of a language that was. Nobody knew about Koine Greek. It's just ordinary street language in the Greek society. But they didn't know that. And so they thought, that's Holy Spirit language. And Latin was God's language. In fact, Jerome claimed that God told him that he spoke Latin. Well, Aelfric understood that folks couldn't read the Latin. They can't read the Greek. They can't read the Hebrew. So he said this. This is what he wrote. Happy is he who can read the Scriptures and translate the words into action. Be ye doers of the word, not hearers only. Aelfric picked up on that point, did he not? I want to notice something about what these fellows faced who were trying to translate at least parts of the Bible into their own languages. They faced 3 obstacles. And I think sometimes these thoughts that they face, these concepts, these obstacles, have come up in the modern times in some people's mind when they think about translation. I'm not opposed to translating work. I think it's necessary, absolutely. I'm opposed to translating into error. And I'm going to be searching for truth all the time I'm using the Bible that I use. But these fellows, as early as it was in their efforts to go from the Anglo-Saxon language to the people by translating from Latin or Greek, the people traditionally had been taught that the only language that could be used in a worship service was Latin. Sound familiar? And so if you have a Bible in Anglo-Saxon, that's blasphemous. If they were around today, they'd say, what are you doing with that Bible that's not in Latin? That's not from God. God's language is Latin. Well, that misunderstanding, that error, caused people to oppose translating work. A second thought. The priests of that day, who knew what the Bible said, became very uneasy about allowing the laity, the common fellow, to read the Bible in his own language. They knew what was going to happen if that occurred. You know, they'd be out of business. And so that made them very uneasy about any kind of translating work. And they would tell their constituents, now, these are not orthodox teachings. Well, they're not in Latin. And the problem is the priests were teaching the unorthodox doctrine. And a third thing, people actually believed, some of them did, maybe the majority in those days, that English was not suitable for religious expression. I'm uneasy today about using American slang in translation. It takes away, to me, from the beauty of the translating work. The King James translation of Psalm 23, for instance, that's the most beautiful ever done. William Lyon Phelps, way back in 1929, who was a professor at Yale, said that was the finest piece of English literature around. Well, sometimes the street language takes away, but I have to remember something. It was Koine Greek that was used to produce the New Testament. That's street language. But people are uneasy about something in their own language, especially if they are of the Roman Catholic tradition or early Protestant traditions. However, we know something. And William Tyndale found it out really the hard way when he tried to produce his Middle English version. Tyndale had to fight those feelings that we just mentioned to make his translation for the people. And he made an interesting discovery. Tyndale said the Greek language of the New Testament agreed with the English far more than the Latin does. And that's a helpful thought. And he said the properties of the Hebrew tongue agree 1,000 times more with the English than it does with the Latin. That may account for the longevity of the King James Version. How come it's been around so long? Because you had a marriage there between two languages, Greek and English, and they were almost without disunity. The English language of that period didn't have as many words in it as it does now. And so they could take an English word and put where that Greek word was and translate it with that English word, and everybody knew what that English word meant. Now you may have some differences. For instance, you have the word prevent in the King James Version, which meant to go before in 1611. Well, now it means to stop something. I'm going to prevent that. Well, in 1611, if I'm going to prevent, I'm going in front of you. And so, but it's interesting that those two languages, when they came together in 1611, produced a perfectly married translation. And so if Tyndale's right, and I think he was, absolutely, that would account for the longevity of the King James. A lot of versions have been made since the King James was, but few have had the longevity of that Bible. Well, those are your early Anglo-Saxon Bibles. What we need to do here is move forward now in our history to the Middle English partial versions. In 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William's army conquered Harold of Hastings, and the northern Anglelanders dominated, and their French Norman language influenced the Anglo-Saxon language, and Middle English is born, 1066. It now is the vernacular of the people. And some partial versions of the Bible, and a rare complete one, maybe two, were done during this period as English developed from Anglo-Saxon to what we call Middle English. In about AD 1200, there lived an Augustinian monk. His name was Orm, O-R-M. Sometimes I see it Ormin, O-R-M-I-N. Like Caedmon, Orm produced a poetical paraphrase of the Gospel accounts and Acts in Middle English. And it is probably the earliest type of that translating work that we have in that particular language. He even did a commentary on Acts in that Middle English language. And that commentary on Acts is known as the Ormulum by Orm, the Augustinian monk. We have what we think is his original manuscript of that commentary. There are 20,000 sentences in it. And if you look at the vocabulary of that text, you'll think you're reading German, Low German. But it really is Middle English. The monk wrote that he did his work so that the young Christian may depend upon the gospel only. So he understood that without translating, nobody could read the Bible. About 100 years later, in AD 1300, around 1320, there lived a man named William of Shoreham. He produced the first prose translation of a part of the Bible in the Middle English, but it's a southern dialect of that English. Shoreham's translation of the Psalms is in Kentish English. And again, he worked from the Latin, not the Greek. He was using the Vulgate in his translating work. But it's interesting to look at his work and see that even in the ancient Middle English, there were different dialects. And so even those people had to have a translation in their Kentish English so they could read it. His translation of the Psalms shows us something. Somebody, and we don't know who, had done some work on the Psalm before William did of Shoreham. And so all of these materials we start gathering give us hints that there were earlier works and people were making an effort to translate the Bible into their own languages. About the same time that William of Shoreham was doing his work, there lived a man that's known in history as the Hermit of Hampole, England. His name was Richard, R-O-L-L-E. I have always pronounced that Roll, but it could be Raleigh. He translated the Psalms, and he did it in the northern dialect of the Middle English language. I'm going to call all of those works Middle English. It's simpler for me to remember that we're not in an Anglo-Saxon language, we're in a Low German Middle English period. And so let me just call them Middle English works, Southern dialect, Northern dialect, whatever it is. But you've moved from Orm to William of Shoreham to Richard Rolle. One of the best known and really complete works from this period is John Wycliffe, W-Y-C-L-I-F, sometimes with two F's and an E. Some people spell it W-Y-C-L-I-F-F-E, others spell it W-Y-C-L-I-F, John Wycliffe. This is a complete Bible. It comes from the middle of the 14th century. Wycliffe lived from 1329 to 1384 AD. However, how much of the work was Wycliffe's and how much was his assistant, who lived longer than he did? His assistant was a man named Nicholas, who came from Hereford, England. And also the work of John Purvey, who was working with Wycliffe. So he had two assistants, Nicholas and John Purvey, and those two did some work after Wycliffe died. And so how much is Wycliffe's and how much are the assistants? It's hard to say. That's still being discussed. I think sometimes people who are teaching general biblical introduction assign their students to study Wycliffe and see if they can find out something. Nicholas of Hereford was working on the Old Testament with Wycliffe. And they were working from the Latin. They completed the entire Old Testament now in 1382. So if anyone ever asks you about the first complete Old Testament Middle English version, that's Wycliffe and Nicholas' work, 1382. Purvey, and I'll talk about his work in just a moment, revised that entire work after Wycliffe died. The final Bible, that we call the Wycliffe Bible, also seems to have been completed by Purvey when he got the New Testament done after Wycliffe's death. If you're familiar with language like ye, oldie, shoppy, Y-E-O-L-D-E, S-H-O-P-P-E, then you're becoming familiar with, you know something about the Middle English language. Ye olde shop, the old shop. This manuscript Bible that Wycliffe and his helpers finally completed was a very expensive thing to buy. And it would be very difficult for an ordinary person to purchase one. Modern students of this period may be required to read Chaucer. Chaucer is using the same language when he wrote that Wycliffe did, Middle English. Wycliffe was strongly opposed to the papacy, the Pope, and he so angered the Pope with his work, Wycliffe did, that after Wycliffe had died and been buried, the Pope sent out an edict that they call a bull. He ordered Wycliffe's body to be exhumed from the grave, burned, and the ashes were thrown in the River Swift in England. Oh, why would you be so angry at having the Bible translated? Do you suppose there's something in the Bible that would tell you the Pope's not really a religious office, that's not really Christianity? Must be. I know it angered that Pope to have the Bible translated. Wycliffe held a Doctor of Theology degree, and for about a 15-year period in his life, he was the chaplain to the King of England. Wycliffe's first extra-biblical writings had to do with transubstantiation. Having read the Bible, Wycliffe knew that the Catholic doctrine that Jesus actually is the bread and Jesus' blood is actually the wine, that there is a transfer from his body to the substance you're taking in the Lord's Supper. Well, Wycliffe knew that wasn't right, and so he wrote against it. And of course, this will anger the Pope. The Pope had issued 5 edicts against Wycliffe before he died. But Wycliffe never backed down and made the Pope so angry, dig him up and burn him. Well, I mentioned John Purvey. Let's talk about his work. Purvey died in 1482. 11 years after Wycliffe's death, this would be 1395, AD 1395, Purvey finished his revision of all that work Wycliffe had done. Purvey took the transliterated words in Wycliffe's Bible and translated them in his work. You remember that a transliterated word is taking letter for letter in the old language and reproducing it letter for letter in the receptor language. Baptizo, baptism. That's a transliterated word. Well, Purvey decided to translate. And when he did this in the Middle English, some of the idioms we still have today came out, and it came to pass. And so you have that kind of thing happening when you actually start translating from one language to another. The idiom starts to come through if it's done right. Let's think about the Pope's influence on Britain at this time, the Anglo-land people. When people began to read Purvey's revision, the Pope's influence in England was dying out. He was being defeated in his teaching. They learned that the Bible was a lot different from what the Catholics were teaching. There wasn't any printing press yet invented, but had it been at that time in the 1300s, I think that Purvey's version would have been out to much more people, and the Catholic influence would have been dispersed in England completely, or at least shut down to almost nothing. Let's move forward. In 1492, a man was born to whom we owe a great deal when it comes to our English Bibles. This Middle English translator was William Tyndale, Tyndale. Tyndale's version lays claim to being the first printed edition of a part of the Bible. Not the first completed English Bible to come off a printing press, because some got theirs to the printer more quickly than Tyndale did. But part of his translating work was the first to be printed on the Gutenberg press, AD 1396. Something else happened in Europe. Europe learned how to make paper from the Chinese people. And so you have paper, not parchment, not vellum, paper, and a printing press. A Latin Bible called the Mazarin Bible, M-A-Z-A-R-I-N, was printed in 1456. Greek was being studied in universities, 1458. So now you're having Latin Bibles printed, Greek Bibles printed. In fact, the first printed Hebrew lexicon or dictionary was printed in 1506. It's interesting that there were 80 printed Latin Bibles that showed up in Europe in 1470. And a fellow named William Caxton took those Bibles to England several years later. And the people doing the Middle English versions were using those Latin Bibles too as part of their source of translating work. But Tyndale, rather than work in the Latin, made the decision that he would work from the Greek and the Hebrew, the original languages of the Old Testament Hebrew and the New Testament Greek. And so his efforts are more in the area of a version. But because the Catholic influence was still strong in England, strong enough, Tyndale had to leave that country. Catholic persecution drove him out of England. He finished his New Testament, Tyndale did, in Cologne in 1526. He finished Genesis through Deuteronomy at Marburg in 1530. He finished Jonah in Antwerp, Belgium in 1531. Those completed sections of his work were smuggled into England, causing further opposition from the papacy and the King of England. The Church of England didn't care for this kind of work either, for obvious reasons. It was teaching against what they were doing. The year that Tyndale finished the Pentateuch, he was kidnapped. But while he was in jail in England, he finished Proverbs, he finished the prophets. In fact, he had nearly the entire Old Testament done, and he was burned at the stake. And as he burned, he yelled out to the people, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Brother Lewis said in his book, From KJV to NIV, that the King James Version seems to be the answer to that prayer. Lord, open the King of England's eyes. King James, in my opinion, was the answer to that prayer. His so-called authorized version, the authorized King James Version, which was never authorized by King James, is practically a fifth revision, number 5, a fifth revision of Tyndale's work. And where it departs from Tyndale's work, when the American Standard was done, the English Revised was done, 1861, the American Standard, 1901, they also went back to Tyndale's version, time and again, to see how he did it. One man in history now, Tyndale, stood against the papacy, stood against the Kingdom of England, was put to death, but gave us a Bible in the Middle English language. A lot of folks have paid a terrible price, the ultimate price, to give us translation. I thank God that I have English Bibles. That's my language. That's the one that I'm used to using every day. But I don't take it for granted. It costs a lot to make some of these works. Now, let's move just one step further. Since Tyndale wasn't completely done when he died, was put to death, murdered, the credit for the first printed, complete Bible in Middle English has to be given to the man who finished Tyndale's work, Miles Coverdale. Coverdale died in 1569. He had been Tyndale's assistant. He was a proofreader when Tyndale was down in Antwerp, Belgium, finishing his Pentateuch and Jonah. And Coverdale used Jerome's Latin Vulgate. He used Luther's German Bible, his German New Testament. He used Tyndale's work and Erasmus' Greek work. And if you look at Coverdale's work alongside of Tyndale's, all that Tyndale got done, and it was almost the whole Bible, you don't see a lot of improvements from Coverdale to Tyndale, or from Tyndale to Coverdale. Coverdale did introduce something. In this Bible, he has chapter summaries. And in this Bible, he separated the Apocrypha, capital A, Apocrypha, from the Bible itself, knowing that these were not divine writings. That Bible was first printed and published in 1535, again in 1550, and again another one in 1553. The true successor to the Coverdale Bible, and I'll talk about it in just a little while if we have time in this session, but the true successor to Coverdale's work is known as the Great Bible. But I have to talk about 2 or 3 others here before I get to the Great Bible. But the ones I'm about to mention are not revisions of Coverdale's work. Those who have studied history know that King Henry VIII had his wife Anne Boleyn put to death. She carried Coverdale's Bible with her that day. But interestingly, her execution somehow brought Coverdale's work into disfavor. Somehow the public got confused about it. And so we have to mention another work right here. And the man whose name is on it isn't named on it. It's his pseudonym, Thomas Matthew, the Matthew Bible. It's a Middle English version. But Thomas Matthew's real name was John Rogers. And he was the first martyr by Bloody Mary, the Catholic queen from the Tudor family in England. And Rogers took Tyndale's work and the Coverdale work as his sources and produced a revision of those two. And if I were studying the French Bible, this version of Matthew's would be the one I would have to refer as the source of the French translation. The French were using a Middle English work by Thomas Matthew or John Rogers to do their work. And so it's interesting that his work found its way into France, but Tyndale's found its way into England. Coverdale had a license to produce his Bible. Rogers got one. But since Coverdale didn't use the original language, he became one attacked by the clergy. Isn't that an interesting charge? Well, he didn't use the original language. Well, maybe he used one that was translated well. He used Latin. And when Rogers put marginal notes in his Bible, he came under attack from the clergy, both the Church of England and the papacy. You see, he added to God's Word. The majority were taught or picked up on the fact that the Coverdale Bible shouldn't be used. And John Rogers' work shouldn't be used. He added to the Bible, and Coverdale didn't use the original. And so these attacks kept these Bibles out of the hand of the majority of the people living in England. The Anglelanders were kept in the dark as to what the Bible said. When Rogers died, a man came along and revised Rogers' work. This work is called the Taverner work. Richard Taverner, Taverner, was a Greek scholar, not a clergyman, not a priest or reverend, but he was a Greek scholar. Taverner's work is the first Middle English version ever to translate the article in the Greek correctly. Let me stop here and comment on that. I have in my library a Bible supposedly developed by the greatest Greek scholars who ever lived, that is published by the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Society. In that Bible, they translate John 1:1, Jesus was a God, little g. What Travener knew way back in the 1500s is that there's no a, no an in Greek. It doesn't exist. This is in a North-Ruth language. It has a definite article, the. The God was Jesus. That's what it says in the Greek. And Jesus was the God. And so these great Greek scholars of the New World Translation are not Greek scholars. There are no a or ands in Greek, and the first English Bible we have where that's done correctly is Travener's work, and he's revising Coverdale's work. And when you have a the in Greek, there are rules that apply to using it. If sometimes when you leave it out, it's for emphasis. If you have a proper name, you put the in front of it, the John, the Peter, the Paul, the God, and that's just the way they did it. And so Travener knew those rules about the Greek language. I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and I'll try to explain why I did that. I had to mention Rogers and Travener's work because they really were being done while a revision of Matthew's Bible was being put together. This was done in 1539, and this revision is called the Great Bible, and I mentioned that earlier, as I said. This Great Bible became a great influence, use the word great twice there, it became a large influence on later English versions. It became much more popular than anything Matthews ever did, than anything that Coverdale ever did, than anything that Rogers ever did, or Travener. It was a Bible that was 16 and a half inches by 11 inches. Big book. And it was put out to try to help people see that they could use a Bible. And those who've been opposed to a Bible with marginal notes or anything else were given a Bible called the Great Bible. In the second edition of the Great Bible, there was a preface put by a man named Thomas Cranmer. He was the Archbishop, Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury. And even there are plays written about Thomas Cranmer. But Cranmer's Bible, the Great Bible, that edition became the official text of the Church of England after Henry VIII died. A reprint of Cranmer's Bible, which was put out in 1553, is the text for the Book of Common Prayer and Administration of Sacraments of all Anglican churches, Methodist, Episcopal, Church of England. All of these Anglican churches have in their liturgy verses from the Great Bible, or Cranmer's Bible, the second edition of the Great Bible. I mentioned just a minute ago Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary. She terrorized English Protestants, had many put to death. Many fled England. They went down to Geneva, Switzerland, a lot of them, because Geneva, Switzerland offered them safe haven. And there lived a man in Geneva, Switzerland named John Knox, K-N-O-X. He was the leading Presbyterian of his day, and John Knox put out a Bible for the refugees in Switzerland who had come from England. That Bible is still called today the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible introduced for us italicized words to indicating that word's not in the original. Okay. And so now you have some chapter summaries and some italicized words in an English Bible. English Bible. The King James Version adopted this method of italicizing words that the translator added because he thought he was giving you the sense of what the verse said. Sometimes it's much better to leave out those italicized words when you're reading the text. But that Geneva Bible, now watch, was the one that the Protestant refugees carried on the Mayflower when they came over here, running from England and other European countries. And there are statements from those Puritans on the Mayflower that they didn't want that modern King James Version that had come out. We'll use our old Geneva Bible. Perhaps it's the case that because the Geneva Bible was the first Middle English Bible done by a committee, not just one person, it became popular. People began to understand, well, we have all these fellows working on it, must be a very good Bible. And it's a good Bible. In fact, the scripture quotations in the preface to the original King James are from the Geneva Bible. And the language in the Geneva Bible is Shakespeare's language. In fact, it influenced the way he wrote, that Bible did. We have to do something else in our next session before we come to the King James Bible, because there is another Middle English version that's very important, and we'll discuss it then. But notice that we've moved from Anglo-Saxon Bibles, the 600s, to Middle English, 1500s, to the Geneva Bible and American people coming to America to escape persecution. But all of that has to do with the thought that we need translations. Are they well done? Well, we have to decide that. But our search is for the truth. And I'm grateful to those who made every effort, gave their lives to produce English translations of God's holy word. Translation is a great study. And in the next session, we'll mention that last Middle English version and move forward to 1611 and the King James Version.